Security. She's no longer authorized. My fingers stopped moving above the keyboard. The deployment dashboard I had been walking everyone through went completely dark on the main presentation screen. Not because of a power issue. Not because of a technical glitch. Because someone standing directly behind me had just pressed a button on a company tablet and ended my employment while I was mid-sentence. I turned around slowly. Melissa Klein, head of human resources, stood at the back of the room gripping a company tablet with both hands. Beside her was Kevin Sloan from corporate security, arms crossed, expression completely unreadable. 32 people were sitting around that long wooden table. Senior engineers, department heads, a compliance liaison from our largest enterprise client, Harman Financial Partners, who had driven 3 hours specifically to observe this deployment confirmation. 2 board observers who had flown in from Chicago the night before. Every single person in that room was now looking directly at me. Eleanor Thomas's system credentials have been revoked effective immediately, Melissa announced, her voice steady and practiced. Please proceed with the meeting. My hands were still resting on the keyboard. I had not moved a single inch. And then, without anyone touching anything, the large display screen at the front of the room filled with clean white text against a solid dark background. Authorization chain incomplete. Deployment suspended. Not one person in that room spoke. The cursor blinked slowly on the screen. I looked at the message. Then I looked at Melissa. She had absolutely no idea what she had just set in motion. Nobody spoke for what felt like a very long time. It was not the silence of confusion. People who are confused look around the room seeking answers from each other. This silence was different. This was the silence of 32 people watching something unfold and beginning to sense, one by one, that it was not going in the direction anyone had planned. Craig Weston, our operations director, sat at the head of the table. Craig was the kind of man who filled a room without trying. He wore expensive cufflinks on ordinary Tuesdays and had a habit of finishing other people's sentences when he thought he already knew the answer. He leaned forward now, straightened his jacket, and reached for the deployment terminal with the calm confidence of someone who had never seriously considered being wrong. He entered the next command in the sequence. Authorization chain incomplete. Deployment suspended. He paused. Then he entered his director-level override code, a code that gave him the highest command authority available to anyone below the executive board. Authorization chain incomplete. Deployment suspended. The room shifted. I felt it before I could see it. Engineers who had been glancing at their own laptops stopped typing. The 2 board observers exchanged a look. The Harman Financial liaison clicked his pen once and set it down on his notepad. Phil Henderson, our lead infrastructure engineer, was sitting 4 seats to my left. He typed something quickly, read the result, and then went very still. Phil knew what the message meant. So did I. I had written the code behind it. Craig looked across the table at me. His expression had shifted from confident to irritated, the way someone looks when a door they expected to open simply does not. My throat felt tight. But it was not panic rising inside me. It was something much steadier than that. I stood up slowly from my chair. The soft sound it made against the floor was the only sound in the room. Every head turned toward me at exactly the same moment, a perfectly synchronized response, like a single organism reacting to a single stimulus. You revoked the wrong credentials, I said. My voice came out calm. Not performed calm. Genuine calm. 12 years of working in systems architecture had taught me something important. Panic makes problems worse, and clarity makes them solvable. This was a moment that required clarity above everything else. Craig made a short dismissive sound. Eleanor, this is not the time for dramatics. I am not being dramatic, I said. The system requires an active, credentialed, independent validation authority to authorize any deployment rated above risk level 3. This deployment is rated level 5. You have just terminated the person holding that authority while the deployment process was live. Melissa straightened slightly behind me. Craig looked at the screen. Authorization chain incomplete. Deployment suspended. One of the board observers, A woman named Patricia Holt, whom I had met once at a quarterly review 18 months ago, leaned sideways and spoke quietly to the man beside her. He uncapped his pen and began writing. Craig pressed execute one more time. Authorization chain incomplete. Deployment suspended. The room was arriving at an understanding that Craig had not yet caught up to. The system was not broken. The system was not malfunctioning. The system was working in precisely the way I had designed it to work 3 years ago, when 2 executives signed a protocol document and then placed it in a compliance binder and never thought about it again. It was refusing their commands. Because they had earned that refusal. My name is Eleanor Thomas. I am 39 years old. For the past 12 years I have worked as a systems architect and infrastructure security lead at Alderton Group, a financial technology company headquartered in Columbus, Ohio. We handle transaction processing, data compliance, and system integration for banking partners across 6 states. My job, described simply, was to build the systems that kept the company's data accurate, protected, and legally sound. It was not visible work. Nobody wrote articles about it. Nobody mentioned it in company all-hands meetings when they talked about growth and innovation. Infrastructure work is like the foundation of a building. Nobody talks about the foundation when everything is standing. They only talk about it when something falls. Most people at Alderton understood in a general way that I worked in IT and that I was involved in compliance. What most people did not fully understand was the specific role I held within the deployment authorization structure. That role had been created quietly, implemented carefully, and documented thoroughly in a binder that lived in the legal department and was referenced approximately never in the years that followed. I had spent 12 years watching executives make fast decisions with slow consequences. I had watched 3 company reorganizations, 2 leadership transitions, and 1 near-catastrophic data event that most of the current staff did not even know had happened. That last event was the reason the safeguard existed. And the safeguard was the reason 32 people were now sitting in a silent room watching a screen tell them no. 3 years before the meeting, on a cold Wednesday morning in November, Alderton nearly destroyed itself from the inside. A senior developer named Paul had been given a 2-day deadline to push a configuration update to the production environment. His manager had told him to move fast. The quarterly milestone was coming. Speed was the priority. Paul moved fast. He skipped the standard validation sequence. The update contained a data mapping conflict that appeared minor in isolation. Scale, it was not minor at all. Within 3 hours, financial transaction records across 4 partner states were generating corrupt outputs. Nothing had been permanently lost yet. But the error was spreading through the system the way a crack spreads through glass, quietly and quickly, and the window to stop it was closing. I caught it because 3 months earlier I had built a passive detection layer that nobody had asked me to build. I built it because I had seen a similar pattern at a previous company, and I believed strongly in preparing for problems before they arrived rather than reacting to them after. I rolled back the update, corrected the mapping conflict, documented everything completely, and submitted a full incident report before most of the executive team had arrived at the office that morning. Arthur Spence, the VP of technology at the time, called me in that afternoon. "How do we make certain this never depends on a single person again?" he asked. I told him exactly how. I had already written the proposal. He read it. He signed it. He got 5 other signatures. Then Arthur left the company during a restructuring. New leadership arrived. And the signed document settled into its binder, quietly and undisturbed. Till now. 6 months before the meeting, Alderton promoted Tyler Briggs to Senior Director of Operations. Tyler was 42. He had come from a faster-moving tech environment and carried that culture with him everywhere he went. He used words like velocity and throughput and drag. He described careful review processes as friction. He described people who asked detailed compliance questions as blockers. Within his first 30 days, Tyler had shortened the standard deployment review window from 5 business days to 2. He had removed 2 approval steps he described in a department memo as legacy redundancies. He had begun holding operational planning meetings to which I was not invited. The first time I was excluded, I assumed it was an oversight and sent a polite note to his assistant. The second time I wrote directly to Tyler. He replied in 3 sentences. The meetings were operational briefings. My involvement would be incorporated at the appropriate stage. He appreciated my thoroughness. I did not receive another invitation. What I received instead were finalized decisions sent to me for acknowledgement. Deployment plans already built around my infrastructure dependencies, presented as done rather than as drafts. Change requests that had skipped the risk classification step my role existed to oversee. I began documenting every instance in a private log on an encrypted personal drive I kept at home. Not because I was building a case against anyone. Because I had learned long ago that the only thing that survives institutional chaos is a clear record of what actually happened and when. On a Thursday morning in March, Melissa Klein called me into her office. Her desk was always arranged the same way. Lined pens, a small plant on the left corner, closed laptop, and on this particular morning, a printed document lying face down near the center of the desk. Melissa offered me a chair and folded her hands. "Eleanor," she said, "we wanted to touch base about how the transition to the new leadership structure has been going for you." I told her that from my perspective things were functioning, though I had identified several recent changes to the deployment review process that I believed carried meaningful compliance risk. She nodded in a way that suggested she had anticipated this response. "Tyler has shared that you've been finding it difficult to adapt to the updated workflows," she said carefully. "I have raised concerns through the appropriate official channels," I said. "That is a defined part of my job description." "Raising concerns is absolutely appropriate," she said. "But there is a difference between raising concerns and creating consistent friction that slows the team's forward momentum." I asked her to show me in writing which specific actions of mine had violated any company policy. She turned over the document lying on her desk. It was a performance improvement framework with my name printed at the top. No prior written warnings. No documented incidents. No dates or examples provided anywhere on the page. I asked for a printed copy before I left the office. She said she would send it by email. I asked again for a printed copy before I left. She did not enjoy that, but she printed it. After my meeting with Melissa, the change in how I was treated became impossible to overlook. I stopped receiving copies of deployment-related email chains. Access request forms that had previously routed through my review queue began going around me entirely. 3 separate infrastructure change tickets were approved by Tyler directly, with no technical risk classification completed and no record of any consultation with my department. None of this surprised me. But here is what Tyler and Melissa had not accounted for. The safeguard I had built 3 years earlier did not live in an email inbox. It was not a policy stored in a shared document folder that someone could quietly update or delete. It was not dependent on whether I was included in meetings or copied on communications. It was hard-coded into the deployment authorization chain itself. Any deployment rated above risk level 3 required active authentication from an independent validation authority. That role existed as a distinct system identity, entirely separate from my general employee credentials. A director-level override could not bypass it. Shortening the review window did not affect it. Reassigning my email access did not touch it. The role had to be present, active, and authenticated for the process to move forward. Held that role. No one else at Alderton held that role. And in 6 months of reorganizing, accelerating, and streamlining, Tyler had never once asked what would happen if that role was suddenly removed from the system. I logged 4 more compliance deviations in my private record. Then I continued doing my work and waited. Not because I wanted anything to go wrong. Because I understood that patterns like this one do not stop on their own. The morning of the deployment demonstration, I arrived at the office at 7:43. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock and carried significant weight. The 2 board observers had flown in from Chicago. Patricia Holt had attended a previous compliance review and knew the company's regulatory obligations in detail. The liaison from Harman Financial Partners was present because this deployment represented a milestone in our service agreement with them, one that came with financial penalties if delayed without cause. Tyler had spent 2 weeks building internal momentum around this demonstration. He had framed it in 3 separate department emails as proof of Alderton's new operational speed. I checked my validation role credentials when I arrived. Everything was active. My system identity was confirmed in the authorization chain. I was authenticated and ready. I took my assigned seat. Tyler had reorganized the room arrangement the previous week. I had been moved from my usual position near the technical terminal to the far end of the table, closer to the door than to the screen. I set my notebook on the table. I placed my encrypted personal drive in my jacket pocket. I folded my hands and waited. At 9:02, Tyler opened the meeting. He introduced the observers and acknowledged the Harman liaison warmly. He spoke for 12 minutes about speed and delivery. At 9:14, he nodded to the lead developer to begin the deployment sequence. I watched the authorization chain on my personal screen. Everything was reading correctly. At 9:17, I heard the door open behind me. I recognized Melissa's footsteps before I turned around. Kevin Sloan walked me out of the building at 9:29. He was professional about it in the way that people are professional when they are uncomfortable with the task they have been assigned. He did not grip my arm. He did not speak above a normal volume. He held the side exit door open while I carried my notebook and my water bottle and absolutely nothing else. I had not argued. I had not raised my voice. I had not made any move toward the terminal after my credentials were revoked, because accessing a system I was no longer authorized to use would have been a policy violation and potentially a legal matter. I understood clearly that there is a difference between holding a position of strength and behaving in a way that undermines it. I had no intention of giving anyone a reason to describe my exit as anything other than orderly. So I walked. Behind me, through the closed meeting room door, I could hear voices. Not words. Just the tone of voices when a conversation has shifted from confident to urgent. In the lobby, Kevin handed me a standard termination form. I read it in full before signing. It confirmed my access had been revoked and that my personal items would be available for pickup within 5 business days. I unclipped my badge from my lanyard and placed it on Kevin's desk without being asked. "You can reach HR to schedule your item pickup," Kevin said quietly. "Thank you, Kevin," I said. I pushed through the front door into the cool morning air. Through the glass behind me, I could already see Kevin's desk phone lighting up. He picked it up and looked out at me through the glass. Kept walking to my car. I sat in my car in the parking garage and did not move for 5 minutes. Not because I was overwhelmed. Not because I needed to collect myself. I sat because I wanted to be completely still and completely clear before the next part of the day began. I had been preparing for a version of this moment for 2 months. Now that it was here, I wanted to step into it deliberately rather than reactively. My phone lit up at 9:41. Craig Weston. I let it ring through to voicemail. At 9:44, an email arrived from Tyler Briggs. The subject line read, "Urgent. Deployment system issue requiring immediate resolution." The body described what had happened as a technical anomaly and requested that I contact the IT help desk to provide remote guidance on resolving the issue. I read it carefully. Then I typed my response. "Thank you for reaching out. As of 9:17 this morning, my employment with Alderton Group was formally terminated and all system credentials were revoked. I no longer have access to any Alderton systems or data. For technical matters, please contact your infrastructure team. For any further communication directed to me personally, please route through my legal counsel." I read it twice. Adjusted 1 word. Sent it. Craig called again at 9:49. I did not answer. I had 2 phone calls to make before noon. Both of them were to people I had already spoken to about exactly this situation. Both conversations would be brief because the groundwork had already been carefully laid. I started my car and pulled out of the parking garage into the late morning light. The first call I made was to Brenda Collins, my personal attorney. Brenda had practiced employment and technology contract law for 19 years. She was methodical, unhurried, and had a gift for identifying the exact sentence in a document that would matter most 6 months later. I had first contacted her 2 months earlier, shortly after Melissa handed me the performance improvement framework on that Thursday morning. I had not gone to Brenda out of panic. I went because I believe in knowing exactly where you stand before the ground shifts beneath you. I asked her to review my employment contract, the safeguard protocol documentation, the signed compliance framework, and the performance improvement framework Melissa had given me. Brenda spent a week reviewing everything carefully. Then she called me and walked through her findings in detail. When I called her from my car at 9:52 that morning, she picked up before the second ring finished. "Tell me what happened," she said. I told her in sequence. No editorializing. Just the timeline. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. "They processed a termination during a live level 5 deployment," she said. It was not quite a question. Yes. And the system suspended operations automatically as a result of the revocation. Exactly as designed. And 2 board observers were present in the room when this occurred. Patricia Holt was one of them. Brenda paused again. When she spoke next, her voice had a sharply focused quality. "Forward every communication you receive from Alderton directly to my office. Do not respond to anything without speaking to me first." "Already forwarded," I said. "Good," she said. "Call me at 2 o'clock. The second call I made was to Walter Brooks. Walter was an independent compliance consultant with 17 years of experience in financial systems auditing. He had conducted external reviews for Alderton twice before, which meant he understood the company's regulatory framework and infrastructure obligations better than most people who did not work there directly. 3 weeks earlier, I had called Walter with a hypothetical question. The question was this: under the current federal oversight framework for financial data systems, if a company terminated the sole holder of a critical deployment authorization role during an active control process, and that termination caused a system-wide suspension, what would happen next? Walter had taken a slow breath before answering. 3 consecutive failed executive override attempts on a suspended Level 5 deployment trigger an automatic mandatory external compliance review, he said. That is not a discretionary process. Cannot be waived internally. It initiates on its own. I had thanked him and ended the call. Now I called him back. "It happened," I said when he answered. He did not ask me to clarify which hypothetical I meant. "I will need the documentation package," he said immediately. "I can have it to you by 3:30 this afternoon," I said. The documentation package had been organized, indexed, and ready to transmit for 6 weeks. "Send it the moment you are home," Walter said. "The clock on the review trigger will have already started." "I know," I said. I merged onto the highway and drove home through a morning that looked completely ordinary from the outside. By 11:30, my phone had logged 14 missed calls, 9 emails, and 3 text messages. The missed calls came from Craig, Tyler, and a number that traced back to Alderton's General Legal Department line. The emails ranged in tone from formally urgent to something approaching desperate. The most recent one from Tyler had the subject line: "System restoration, time sensitive. Please advise." The text messages were from Phil Henderson. Phil and I had worked alongside each other for 6 years. He was the kind of engineer who understood complex systems the way certain people understand music, not just the notes but the space between them. He did not send personal messages often. When he did, they were always precise. His first message said, "They have tried 11 override commands. Nothing is working. Tyler is telling people it is a software defect." His second message, sent 22 minutes later, said, "Legal just came upstairs. I think someone finally opened the compliance binder." I set my phone down on my kitchen table and allowed myself one quiet moment of something that felt remarkably close to relief. The compliance binder was a 3-inch physical document I had submitted to the legal department 3 years ago when the safeguard protocol was first implemented. It contained the complete technical specifications of the authorization chain, an executive summary written in plain language, and a signature page bearing 6 names. One of those names belonged to Patricia Holt, the board observer who had been sitting in the meeting room that morning writing careful notes when the suspension message appeared on screen. I forwarded Phil's messages to Brenda. Then I opened my laptop and began organizing my formal statement. Brenda called me at 2:07 with the first significant external consequence. Harmon Financial Partners, the enterprise client whose compliance liaison had been sitting in the meeting room that morning, had issued a formal request for deployment confirmation by 5 o'clock that afternoon. This was a contractual milestone. Missing it without documented cause would trigger a penalty clause in our service agreement. Alderton could not provide confirmation. Every certification document in the deployment package required an authenticated signature from the Independent Validation Authority. My role. The transfer of that role to another qualified individual required a formal review period of no fewer than 10 business days, as specified in the Safeguard Protocol document. That requirement existed to prevent exactly the kind of rushed authorization that had nearly caused the data corruption incident 3 years earlier. Alderton did not have 10 business days. They had 2 hours and 53 minutes until the Harmon deadline. Their legal team has already confirmed with our team that no provisional pathway exists for a Level 5 deployment, Brenda said. Section 9 is unambiguous. It is, I said. I had written Section 9 myself. The Harmon liaison left the building at 1:15, Brenda added. He did not look pleased. I did not find satisfaction in that. Harmon had done nothing wrong. They were simply the visible consequence of decisions made by people who had not read the documentation they had signed. Has anyone contacted you about reinstatement? Brenda asked. Craig Weston has left 2 voicemails asking to speak informally, I said. Do not respond, Brenda said firmly. Everything threw me. The following morning, Phil sent me a message at 7:48. Tyler sent a department-wide communication last night. He is telling the team that you installed a personal lockout in the system before you were escorted out. He is calling it deliberate sabotage. I read the message sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee. I forwarded it immediately to Brenda and to Walter. Brenda responded within 5 minutes. This is extraordinarily helpful. Save everything. Walter responded within 8 minutes. The auditors will find this very relevant. What Tyler apparently had not considered was that making a specific factual claim in writing, and distributing that claim to employees through a documented internal communication channel, created a record that could be tested directly against evidence. The evidence was not ambiguous. The Safeguard Protocol had been designed, peer-reviewed, approved, implemented, and documented 3 years before Tyler Briggs had ever set foot in the building. The authorization chain had not been modified since its original installation. There was no lockout. There was no sabotage. There was a system executing a protocol that a group of executives had signed their names to and then filed away and forgotten. Tyler's written claim would become, as Brenda later described it in our 2 o'clock call, one of the single most useful documents produced by anyone in this entire situation. Not because it revealed anything I did not already know. Because it was a provably false statement made in writing by a person who was about to face auditors. Walter called me at 3:15 that afternoon with a formal update. The external compliance review had been triggered automatically at 11:53 the previous morning, approximately 2 hours after the meeting ended. It had initiated based on the system log showing 3 consecutive failed executive override attempts on a suspended Level 5 deployment. This was not something I had requested. It was not something Brenda had filed for. It was not something anyone at Alderton had invited or anticipated. It had happened because 3 years ago a group of executives approved a compliance framework that included an automatic review trigger, and that framework had just done exactly what it was designed to do. The reviewing body was the Midwest Financial Systems Compliance Authority, an independent regulatory organization with oversight authority over financial technology companies operating across multiple states. Their findings were not suggestions. They were binding. 2 senior auditors had been assigned. Their review would begin the next morning. They will want a formal statement from you, Walter told me. A clean, factual account in chronological order, supported by documentation. It is already prepared, I said. He paused. How long have you been working on it? The documentation log goes back 2 months, I said. The formal statement I drafted over the past 2 days. Walter exhaled slowly. Eleanor, he said, the people who come through situations like this with their integrity fully intact are always the ones who kept clear records. I know, I said. That is why I kept them. The auditors met with me on a Thursday morning in a neutral office suite downtown that Walter had arranged. Their names were Sandra Pugh and Howard Finch. Sandra led the session. She had the manner of someone who has sat across from many people in many uncomfortable situations, and has learned to ask questions that measure consistency rather than hunt for drama. Howard took careful notes and occasionally asked a brief clarifying question in a quiet and deliberate voice. Sandra opened with the first formal question. Who removed the validation authority during a live deployment? Answered clearly. Melissa Klein, head of human resources, had initiated the credential revocation using a company tablet at 9:17 in the morning. The deployment sequence had been active for approximately 15 minutes at that point. Was Ms. Klein aware that a level 5 deployment was in active progress when she processed the termination? She was present in the meeting room, I said. She entered while the sequence was already underway. Was there any documented operational impact assessment conducted before the termination was processed? I placed 3 pages on the table in front of Sandra. They were internal communication records showing the termination order had been issued at 8:59 that morning. There was no record of any review of the deployment schedule in relation to that timing. No impact assessment. No operational hold request of any kind. Sandra read each page carefully. Then she looked at Howard. He looked back at her. Neither spoke for a moment. Howard wrote something in his notebook that covered most of a full page. Sandra's second question came after a deliberate pause. Who authorized the deployment to proceed without confirming that the required validation role was active and properly authenticated? I laid the deployment approval chain on the table. Tyler Briggs had issued the go-ahead at 8:45 in the morning. The required technical pre-deployment checklist attached to that authorization included a specific line item for validation role confirmation. That line item had been marked complete. It had not been verified through the system. My validation role authentication had never been queried through the official confirmation channel that morning. Tyler had proceeded on the assumption that my continued employment meant the authorization was in place. He had not completed the step that would have confirmed or denied that assumption. He had marked the box checked without actually checking it. Howard stopped writing and looked up slowly. The authorization was self-certified without actual system verification, he said. Correct, I said. I placed the system log on the table beside the checklist. It showed clearly that no formal validation query had been initiated before the deployment sequence began. The suspension had triggered the moment my credentials were revoked because the system had then performed its own check of the authorization chain and found the required role no longer active. Sandra studied the log for a full minute without speaking. The system identified the incomplete chain at the moment of credential revocation, she said. Yes, I said. That is exactly what it was designed to do. The third question was the one I had spent the most time preparing for. Sandra placed her pen flat on the table and looked at me directly. Why was the safeguarding engineer terminated mid-process? What formally documented performance issues existed at the time to support that decision? I set my complete performance file on the table. 12 years of annual evaluations. Every rating from my first year through my most recent full review was either meets expectations or above it. My review completed 8 months earlier had rated me as exceeds expectations in 4 out of 6 performance categories. Beside the performance file, I placed the performance improvement framework Melissa had handed me in March. Then I placed the email record showing it had been issued without any prior written warning and without any documented incident report preceding it. Sandra picked up the framework and read it completely. The stated concerns are described as resistance to updated workflow processes, communication style not aligned with current leadership culture, and difficulty adapting to accelerated delivery timelines, she read aloud. Then she looked up. No specific incidents are referenced. No dates. No previous documented warnings of any kind. Correct, I said. In 12 years of employment, were you issued any formal written warning prior to this framework? No. Were you ever placed on a performance review of any kind before this document? No. Howard had stopped writing entirely. He was reading through the performance file page by page with the focused attention of someone carefully building a complete picture. Sandra looked at Howard. The look between them lasted longer than the previous ones. Then she picked up her pen again and wrote steadily for a full minute. The consequences moved faster than I had anticipated. Within 72 hours of the audit interviews, the Midwest Financial Systems Compliance Authority issued a preliminary findings report. Walter called me the morning it was released and walked me through the key points by phone. All company-wide deployment operations at Alderton had been formally suspended pending remediation. Every scheduled rollout, system update, and infrastructure change was on hold. The authorization chain could not be restored to operational status without the validation role being properly reinstated through a fully compliant process. The financial impact was immediate and measurable. 3 enterprise client contracts had performance milestones tied to the deployment schedule. All 3 milestones were now in delay status. 2 of those clients had issued formal breach of timeline notices within 24 hours of the suspension announcement. An emergency board meeting had been called for Friday morning. Tyler Briggs had been suspended from all operational authority pending the investigation outcome. The promotion that had been announced internally 6 months earlier with a department-wide email was formally revoked. Melissa Klein had been placed on administrative leave while the authority reviewed whether the termination had been processed in violation of the company's own controlled operation protocols, a policy her department had helped draft 2 years prior. Phil sent me a text that evening. It said simply, "The building is very quiet today." I replied, "I hope the team is holding up." He said, "Everyone is okay. Are you?" I considered that question honestly before answering. "Yes," I said. "I genuinely am." I delivered my formal statement to the compliance authority the following Monday. Brenda and Walter had spent the prior weekend reviewing it with me carefully. Not to make it compelling or persuasive. Simply to make certain every fact was accurate, every date was verifiable, and every document reference was properly supported by the physical record behind it. Sandra Pugh and Howard Finch were present again. A third person sat to Sandra's left, a regulatory attorney from the authority's legal office named Gail Porter. She observed throughout, wrote continuously, but did not ask any questions directly. I walked through the events in complete chronological sequence. The near disaster 3 years earlier, the safeguard proposal and the signatures obtained, the restructuring under Tyler, the bypassed review steps and the excluded meetings, the performance improvement framework, the morning of the deployment demonstration, the moment the credentials were revoked, the system response. Sandra stopped me once, near the end of my account. When the suspension message appeared on screen and everyone in the room turned to look at you, she said, "What were you thinking in that moment?" It was the only question that I had not anticipated. I took my time before answering. "I was thinking that the system had done exactly what it was designed to do," I said. "And that the people in that room were now going to have to come to terms with something they had spent several months trying to move around." Sandra held my gaze for a steady moment. Then she said, in a voice that was careful and measured, "The system performed correctly." She said it the way a person says something they already know will appear in an official document that many people will read for a long time. The final compliance report was released 4 weeks after the initial incident. It was 28 pages long. Walter called me the morning it was issued and read me the relevant sections by phone. Melissa Klein had violated Alderton's controlled operation protocol by processing a personnel termination during an active Level 5 deployment without completing a mandatory operational impact assessment. That assessment requirement appeared in a policy document that Melissa's own HR department had helped draft. The report used the phrase clear procedural violation without qualification. Tyler Briggs had initiated a Level 5 deployment without completing the required validation role confirmation step, and had self-certified the pre-deployment checklist as complete when the confirmation step had never been performed. The report described this as a material misrepresentation in the authorization record. Tyler's written communication to staff claiming I had installed a deliberate personal lockout had been reviewed against the full system architecture documentation and found to be entirely without technical basis. The report recommended a formal written retraction be distributed to all staff who had received the original communication. Both Melissa and Tyler were removed from their positions. The board accepted their departures within 48 hours of the report's public release. The remediation plan required Alderton to fully restore the authorization chain, conduct a mandatory review of all compliance protocols modified in the previous 6 months, and operate under 60 days of independent external oversight. The authorization chain could not be restored without the validation role. The phone calls that followed were a great deal more respectful than the ones from the week before. Brenda received the formal reinstatement offer from Alderton Corporate on a Tuesday afternoon and called me within the hour. The package was detailed and carefully constructed. Full reinstatement to my previous role, with a title elevation to Principal Systems Architect. Backdated compensation covering the complete period from my termination date forward. A formal written retraction of Tyler's sabotage claim, distributed to every employee who had received the original internal communication. An official acknowledgement from corporate leadership that the termination had been procedurally improper, and that no performance-related concerns had ever been substantiated against me. Brenda read each item aloud without editorializing. I listened to all of it before I spoke. I asked for 48 hours to consider. She understood without needing an explanation. I did not need 48 hours because I was undecided. I needed it because I wanted to make the decision from a settled and clear place rather than a reactive one. I had spent 2 months preparing carefully for this situation. I was not going to stop being careful now. What I wanted from my work was straightforward. I wanted to build systems that genuinely protected people. I wanted to work within a structure that treated safeguards as a form of intelligence rather than a form of obstruction. I wanted to work alongside people who understood that moving carefully and moving well were not opposites. Then, the day after Brenda presented the offer, an email arrived from Sandra Pugh. Not from the compliance authority. From Sandra personally. Sandra's email was 2 paragraphs. In the first paragraph, she introduced a firm she was affiliated with called Pugh & Finch Systems Review, a well-regarded independent consultancy specializing in compliance infrastructure for financial technology companies. They worked with organizations across 9 states. Their focus was helping companies build authorization frameworks from the ground up, conduct operational risk assessments, and develop internal teams who understood clearly the difference between moving fast and moving recklessly. In the second paragraph, she said they were looking for a principal compliance architect. Someone who could design safeguard systems that lasted. Someone who could identify the gaps that internal teams were too close to see. Someone who understood, in Sandra's exact words, that the most important systems are always the ones people stop thinking about until they desperately need them. I read both paragraphs 3 times. I accepted Alderton's backdated compensation in full. Brenda negotiated the formal retraction distribution and the corporate acknowledgement without requiring my return as a condition of either. I declined reinstatement. I accepted Sandra's offer. My first week at Pugh & Finch, I reviewed compliance documentation for 5 client companies. 3 of them had authorization gaps in their deployment frameworks that had never been flagged internally. In 2 of those cases, the engineer responsible for oversight had been quietly excluded from planning meetings by a newer manager who found careful questions inconvenient. I documented everything I found, clearly, in sequence, with dates and full supporting records. On my desk I kept nothing decorative. Just a notepad, a reliable pen, and the understanding that had guided every decision I had made across 12 years. The systems that protect people are only as strong as the people willing to build them with integrity. And I had never once been willing to build them any other way.